To the vegans and vegetarians, especially to the vegans, where do you get your protein from? This is a question that is on the internet and is discussed heavily has been over the years. And I didn't realize how important this question is. Because what I realized as of the last days is the following. If you just want to go vegan, you have the problem that you don't have a lever for protein. With every unit of food that is rich in protein, such as lentils for example, comes a certain amount of carbohydrates and also fat. Now, if you want to reduce the carbohydrates, but still have the protein, you have the problem that you cannot undock these two. The only solution to this would be a protein powder, but this significantly increases the price of your nutrition, much rather the cost. Now, if you want to go keto, which is 25 to 50 grams of carbs per day, which reduces the carbs and therefore also maybe reduces the hunger you experience on a day-to-day basis, and maybe also is just better in overall. But maybe it is not, the science is not, or rather the data is not so much clear on this. But now, for myself, I decided I wanted to do keto, but I previously already decided I wanted to be vegetarian, actually 6 years ago, and I have been vegetarian ever since. So now, what is the problem with being vegetarian, but also wanting enough protein? It is the protein, because so I tried to make kind of the perfect nutritional shake, made out of whole foods you could buy at the supermarket. You wouldn't have the need to get it delivered, because this is also an additional delivery cost, usually, if you are not subscribed to something like Amazon Prime. And also, it is an additional cost on the environment. Not necessarily one-to-one, but you could argue that if you deliver something to a supermarket, then it is kind of a combined package of many more things, and therefore the delivery itself is more efficient than delivering one item to one single user or customer. So now, the problem is, I realized that with making the nutritional shake that I could get at the supermarket, that would also be purchasable on a one basis, so for one given day, but also very easily multipliable for a given week. And I had many other constraints. I also wanted to reduce the waste, so I didn't want to buy necessarily something that is wrapped in plastic or even in a plastic cup, for example. But what I realized is that when I then looked at the results, and I actually made a video about creating this, or the first iteration of this shake, because previously I already tried fuel. The problem with fuel, I think, is that you only have really the macronutrient side covered. Of course, you also have the micronutrients, and that's not entirely what I mean. What I mean is that you don't have the potential benefits of vegetables, for example, in your diet, but you only are using kind of the current state of science in order to determine the nutritional value. But we will probably discover, and also we have already discovered, or scientists, not me, have discovered that there are many benefits to eating something like a cucumber. As an example, a cucumber has very much water in it. So what this means is that the insulin response to something that is in the form of a cucumber is something that is much higher, not much higher, much lower than the same nutrient value in a powder form, for example. This is also partially the reason drinking the nutrition actually then makes sense. Because you add water again, and therefore you reduce probably the insulin response, at least to some degree. Because you delay kind of the macronutrient intake from your, or transfer from your gut and your stomach to, and your digestive tract to your bloodstream. So now, what I realized after making this shake out of vegetables, out of 200 grams of nuts, out of oils and spices, that's basically the main ingredients, is that it was very low in protein. And I also realized one thing. I did kind of experience problems with my nutrition, and what I mean by this is, before a certain point in my life, I did never really think about nutrition. This also very conveniently aligns with the point where I actually moved out, so therefore someone else didn't manage my nutrition anymore. But it also aligned with me going vegetarian. And I asked myself, could there be a potential link? Of course, there are also many other variables I already explored, but what I didn't really explore was the fact that maybe meat might just have a potential benefit that a vegetarian diet or also a vegan diet doesn't have. So what I did in the next years was to experiment with different dairies, for example, curd, for example, for protein. I also ate this thing called fresh cheese. I don't know what the exact word is. And this has a lot of protein. But then there is also the downside that dairies, for example, have supposedly are much rather linked to potentially higher inflammatory markers in your body. So now I wanted to get rid of the dairies, and also the dairies are usually packed in something that's very plasticky. So getting rid of the dairies was basically more or less a step I already had taken. Of course, I still did allow myself to consume these every time I craved them. But the default was to not eat them. Not crave them, but to not eat them. So the only thing I did consume that was not vegan was eggs and also fish oil and supplements. What I had in the last years was a constant problem with my nutrition. It never just worked. It never worked up to the point where I just could completely forget about it, where it was basically a routine that was as established and I didn't have to think about it anymore. And also, it would be the ideal nutrition. That's kind of what I'm trying to achieve. Of course, the perfect thing is something you can never really achieve, but you always have to strive for it. But I would assume that approximating the perfect thing by maybe 80%, by 60%, maybe by 50% even, would be something that would be achievable and also something that would be worth striving for. So now, what I did over the last years is I experimented with going vegan, with having eggs in my diet, with frying the eggs, with making this cooked and this fresh bowl, with different volumes in terms of food and how these would saturate me, with different macronutrient proportions and how these would saturate me. And what I realized over all of these years was something, it's not what I realized over all of these years, is maybe the thing I failed to see over all of these years, that the assumption that I heard on the internet many times cited, that you only need 0.8 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight, divided by 2 if you want to get the pounds, but of course the pounds in the UK and the US I think are also different, and also there are pounds in other countries. Nevertheless, let's go back to the kilogram. Maybe the main problem was the protein all along. Because, as I mentioned earlier, with every unit of protein you get from a vegan source, you also get a certain amount of either carbs or fat. So now, what you could potentially do is, you take something that is very rich in protein and in fat, and then you are trying to up your protein intake. What happens is that, because both scale kind of linearly, if you increase the protein, let's say from peanut butter or from peanuts, which are actually quite high in protein, you could say, then you also increase the fat. So therefore, if you, for a daily portion, you could say, and I'm also trying to do 1 meal a day, kind of, or at least 2 meals a day within a certain period. So basically intermittent fasting, you could also say. If you then take peanut butter and you increase the protein from peanut butter, you also increase the fat intake. But you also increase the carb intake. So if you want to do something like keto, which in my eyes, and then also in my experience whenever it worked actually, is something that is worth pursuing. Because by going keto, so here are the benefits from keto. I have from anecdata, you could say, so from my personal experience. I do have kind of a higher state of mind when I'm on keto or when I'm fasting, but not in the switching period. The switching period from eating carbs to fasting, so to burning fat, and before burning carbs as main fuel, is something that is not very pleasant. And therefore, an objective would be to shorten this period as maximally as possible. Because then you wouldn't experience these downsides. I also it's not that something that I realized, but it's something that I'm guessing, is that being hungry, for example, and being hungry over a long period of time is maybe just time management and meal timing, basically. So let's assume you have 3 meals a day, and all of these 3 meals actually don't cover the energy that is consumed until the next meal. So therefore, you also don't store the thing. Carbs, for example, are stored in the liver as liver glycogen, but also in the muscles. So now, and they're also directly used from the current consumption, basically, of your body. So what now happens is that, let's say you would eat once and then fast for 3 days. You would eat, then if you had carbs in there, they would get stored in your liver and also in your muscles. The muscle glycogen is actually rebuilt constantly from fat. Not constantly, but in periods where you don't use your muscles as much. At least when you are fasting. So for this reason, you actually don't need carbs at all. That's kind of really controversial, but it also is true. The only thing you actually externally need from food is, of course, the micronutrients, but in terms of the macronutrients, only the protein, and also the protein given a different or a set ratio of the different amino acids, and also the fats, because they're also essential fats. So now you could argue that you could just leave out the carbs. The problem is that with every normal food, with every whole food you have, there is a certain amount of other nutrients you usually get with, because there is no food that has just protein. Or is there? That's the big question. And I heard these stories of Hollywood stars eating only rice and protein. Not rice and protein, but rice and chicken breast. And for the first time in years, I just took a look at the macronutrients of meat. But before we take a look at the macronutrients of meat, let's first of all take a look at the macronutrients of the shake I came up with. It's 2,500 calories. Ideally, it would not be ideally. The thing I'm trying to do is 2,000 calories of basically macronutrients, and then the rest is micronutrients, A, E, or EA. I think it is therefore EA, vegetables. So now I am scrolling through this, and then I'm going through this. Of course, you cannot see them both at the same time, but this also allows me to make these videos at a much quicker pace. So therefore, let's just now take a look at all the different ingredients we have. And it's bell pepper, tomatoes, cucumber, we have vinegar, normal vinegar, then we have mixed vegetables, we have also 200 grams of eggs, and these 200 grams of eggs result in 1,300 calories. And these are the main protein source in terms of this vegan protein shake. The problem now is they only result in 32 grams of protein. Now, given I weigh around 75 to 80 kilograms, this means, let's just take the 80 kilograms, I would need, with the 1 gram per kilogram rule, I would already need 80 grams of protein, which is very hard to achieve with these foods. Because for every unit of protein, so basically every calorie comes with a certain macronutrient distribution or ratio. And with vegan foods, you just don't have a ratio where you can just have one food as a protein level. I cannot just add 100 grams of peanuts and not have significantly more calories, because they also come with significantly more fat, and since fat has 9 grams per gram, so 9 kilocalories per gram, and protein and carbs have around 4, this means I cannot just add something in order to get more protein, but I actually have to switch something up. And switching something up would be maybe, instead of having 0 eggs as currently in there, having 5 eggs in there. That's what I did in the past. And eggs are kind of the only real food that is not dairy that allows you to kind of use something as a leverage. So, but first of all, let's go through the rest here, what we have here. Most of these things are normal units, you could say. So the bell pepper is 1, the tomatoes are 2, even though I still have it in grams in here. The cucumber is just half a cucumber. Then we have the vinegar. In some, I don't have an exact ratio, or rather weight, or also volume here, but I usually just use a little bit of vinegar, I guess. This mostly comes from the salad, but it also is something that is useful, I guess, without the salad. So it's not just for taste, I guess, but it is also has its use, especially apple cider vinegar. Then we have the 200 grams of mixed nuts. We have olive oil, 25 grams. We have soup spice. We have pumpkin oil, pumpkin seed oil. We have flaxseed oil, and then avocado. And then also we have a few minor things. And then also a multivitamin and omega-3 fatty acids. And I actually need 10 capsules of these in order to get the 2 grams recommended daily intake. And this already results in 110 calories. So now, let's tinker with this. Let's tinker with this, and instead of going with this distribution, which didn't focus now, and it was the olive oil instead of the nuts. If I reduce now the nuts, the problem I have with this approach is that it is not clear how much I should eat in a given day. Because if I have a full bag of nuts, I tend to eat a full bag of nuts. That's just what I do in terms of food. So, of course, this is not optimal, and it would be nice if I could control this more, and sometimes I can control this more, but it shouldn't be something I need to control. What if it already was automated? Let's say you lived actually on the moon, and on the moon there are no cookies. So how high now would be the chances that you get cookies for the rest of your life? Not very high. Of course, somebody could launch a rocket and then bring you cookies, but let's say you live on Mars, or let's say you live in an entirely different galaxy without cookies. The chances you are eating cookies in this environment would be 0. And that's what you maybe should try to achieve instead of trying to control your food intake with willpower. Because that's what also the food industry is using in order to sell you crappy foods with a high profit margin. So now, let's take the nuts and bring them down, because the nuts have quite a lot of calories, but don't give us enough protein. So therefore, I have to get rid of the calories somehow, and the nuts are the main source of calories here. So I do 100 grams of nuts. This then results in 650 calories with 13 grams of carbs, 57 grams of fat, and 16 grams of protein. If I do this now, this all results in 1.7k calories and only 39 grams of protein. Because from the vegetables, you do not really get protein. Of course, the vegetables are also something different in a way, or to the extent, or let's just say, the vegetables are full of water. So therefore, what you actually get as a nutritional label on the back of a tomato, for example, if these existed for tomatoes, you would get this very polluted, because if you actually took out the water, which you obviously can't get any calories out of, then you would be left with different macronutrient ratios. That's not true. You wouldn't be left with different macronutrient ratios, but you would only be left with a different weight ratio, kind of. So for every 100 gram of tomato, 90 grams of the tomato are at least water. So therefore, if a tomato, for example, has, let's say, 2.5 grams of protein, 0.5 grams of fat, and 6.5 grams of carbs, this actually is not really the real thing. Because what we need to consider instead of the weight, because vegetables are mostly water, what we actually need to consider, and what would be maybe much more useful as an informational label, would be how much protein, how much fat, and how much carbs per unit of not weight but calorie. So to measure this, we take the 3 different macronutrients and then we average them, and for every calorie of tomato, for example, how much protein do we get? This would be much more useful in terms of actually coming up with a good macronutrient distribution. But of course that's not how it works, at least as of currently, so therefore we have to go with this. So now let's try to add some protein. And the main thing you can still eat, of course, different kind of nuts have different macronutrient ratios. Some have more fat, some have less carbs. But in general, for every unit of protein you get from nuts, you also usually get at least half of it in terms of carbs. So now, the problem is, we already have 60 grams of carbs in here, just because of all the vegetables. So there is no way I now can get it under 50 grams of carbs. And that's the problem. So what I need to do is reduce the volume of the vegetables, or the weight, or much more the calories of the vegetables in some way or another. If I do this and actually reduce them to the actual size, so not just, let's say, 250 grams as a standard size for the mixed vegetables I get in the frozen vegetables. This is kind of just a standard size, even though it's not totally the thing I have. This results in this here. So it's basically the same thing with 200 grams of nuts, but I reduce the vegetables to the actual amount and not just a amount. And this results in 2.5k calories and only 50 grams of protein, but 65 grams of carbs again. So therefore, let's now here replace 100 grams of nuts with 5 eggs. So one single egg has usually 72 calories. This results in 0.5 grams of carbs. And this is already very important. 0.5 grams of carbs with 72 calories. That's a very low carb ratio. And that's also why the eggs are used in keto so much. 4.8 grams of fat, but since we are on keto, and it's also not that much fat, that's very nice. And 6.3 grams of protein. So it is more protein in terms of grams than the other two sources, even though the fat, again, because it is twice as high in terms of the energy density, distributes the most amount to the total calories. So now, what we could do is we could, instead of adding just one egg, just adding 5 eggs. 5 eggs is already quite a high egg intake, especially if you do this every single day. What this results in is 358 calories, 1.8 grams of carbs, so the carbs are still almost non-existent. 23 grams of fat, and also the fats in the eggs are usually something that you can very easily use because they are quite bioavailable, at least when you cook the eggs, because if you cook the eggs, you actually double the bioavailability, and then this results actually in the protein. And you can use the protein up to 90%, I think, whereas if you don't cook the eggs and would theoretically drink them raw or eat them raw, you would only get about 50% of the protein. So now we have 31 grams of protein. So now if we add this, we have a total of 2.1k calories. Actually, it's not k calories, so k stands for 1000, but kilocalories is actually the unit we use for calories. So calories is just short for kilocalories. If we now add 2.5k of kilocalories, this is a double of calories, so therefore actually, at least in theory, the unit we would need to use would be the next not physical, but the unit physicians, not physicians, but physicists use, and this would be kilo, mega, giga. So it would be megacalories, 2.1 megacalories. But we still have a problem. So now we have 53 grams of total carbs. We also just reduced the total amount of calories, as I said. We have 188 grams of fat, which is not that important, because as long as we hit our calorie goal, and as long as we hit our carb goal, and as long as we hit our protein goal, then the fat is just the thing that is left and therefore determined by the other variables. So now, this is maybe a better approach. We have 64 grams of protein compared to the 50 before. And we also have significantly less carbs, almost close to the upper bound of what is considered keto with 50 grams. And here it is 53. I think there is just no way you can actually have 50 or 25 grams of carbs eating normal vegetables, kind of. And I already only took the vegetables that don't have high amounts of carbs. And I left these high carb vegetables already out. So these are only the vegetables that are left that don't contribute too much to the total amount of carbs, to the net carbs you could also say in a given day. So now we still are left only with 64 grams of protein, which is still not even 1 gram per kilogram. And this is the main problem. This is the main problem of coming up with a diet that actually has enough protein, because protein actually has a huge satiation effect. And protein, I think, to some degree at least, is the thing you crave when you have kind of this empty stomach. It's not really sweets, because sweets actually don't do anything for you. They give you basically sometimes a headache. They make your brain go wild for 20 minutes, not for 20 minutes, but for 2 hours, depending on your source. And then you are left in this void of low sugar, and you want to eat again, but of course you cannot really, because you already ate too much calories to begin with, or maybe not. But the problem is, carbs inherently and the easier the carbs, so the simpler the carb structure. Sugar is a very easy carb. It is basically just a simple molecule. Then we have sugars that are made up out of 2 molecules, and then we have sugars that are made up of multiple molecules, and these are the normal carbohydrates. And what we usually describe as sugar is the 1 or the 2 unit molecules. Not unit molecules, but the thing that is made up of these molecules. Sugar. So basically, this is an endless optimization problem here. We cannot get enough protein without adding something like a protein shake, or just protein powder, or artificially increasing the amount of protein that is there by extracting the protein from peas, for example, and then adding it to this. This is the approach Huel, for example, took. They just extracted pea protein. And this is also the main protein powder for vegans. Pea protein powder, I guess. So now, what we could do, theoretically, is we could just take the one food we have that we could potentially use as a lever. And this one food we have that is still not in focus is the eggs. And so what we could potentially do, I mean, 5 eggs is already quite much. What we could do is we could just double the eggs. Because this would also result in 1 package of eggs. 1 box of eggs usually has 10 eggs in it. And this then would result in 10 eggs. And therefore we could just go to the supermarket and let's just say we fast for 3 days, and then we can make the fast for 3 days. And in terms of how often you should do long-term fast, I think, at least for me, I have decided that I attempt at least 4 longer fasts in a given year, with longer fasts being a week of fasting, which is quite controversial on the one side, which also has supposed health benefits, but probably increases longevity in the long term. And not that I understand all of these things, but it's much more what I have copied from people who understand these things much better. I think Peter Attia mentioned this exact protocol, that he fasts for 1 week in a given quarter. And Tim Ferriss, for example, I think does something very similar. So this is kind of what I just copied from these people that are much more knowledgeable than me in terms of these things. So now, what we could potentially do is up the calories from the eggs. But this would result in a ridiculous 10 eggs in a given day. So, I mean, 10 eggs is already quite much. Because sometimes if you normally eat eggs, you maybe take 2 eggs. And then you eat 2 eggs for breakfast. Then sometimes you take 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 if you only want to eat eggs. But 10 eggs in a given day. And if this is 1 meal, let's just say you put 10 eggs in a pan and you also add vegetables, for example, then this is just a lot. So, and it also doesn't really... I'm trying to avoid these products. I'm trying to make my CO2 impact as little as possible. Also, I'm trying to reduce my impact on multi-resistant bacteria. Maybe I'm trying to lower that impact by maybe not supporting something like eating eggs all day long. And if I do currently buy eggs, given budget constraints, because I'm not a millionaire, what I need to do is, and also because of inflation, I just don't want to have a food budget of maybe 500 euros in a given month, just for myself. This is something that more and more in my mind begins to be accepted if I try to tinker around with these different values. And then I say to myself, oh yeah, this is the most important thing. But it is still a thing that is within financial constraints. And so therefore, of course, I could go organic with all the things. I'm currently not buying organic food, even though ideally I would. But this would just increase my food budget. And so therefore, in the long term, I also have to think about the given interest I receive for the money I would now spend, or for the surplus I would spend for the premium. Basically, I would spend on food that then in maybe 20, maybe 50 years would result in a much larger amount of money I would then have and could potentially lever this amount of money. So basically, it's just playing with levers. If I now reduce, basically, the lever in my food, of course I'm increasing the potential health damage from these pesticides, for example. And also I am contributing to something like having chickens in cages, which is something I don't really want to. But also I have to think about my protein. And this is, of course, a ridiculous comparison, but the last years have just showed me that there is maybe a way at which it can work, and I can just focus all day. I only have to sleep for 6 hours a night. And then there's a way at which it just doesn't work, where I sleep significantly more, where I just spend a large amount of my day, not a large amount of my day, but compared to what I would consider as ideal, I just spend too much time cooking and preparing food, and also thinking about food, craving different foods. This is just not something that contributes in any way to society, but also not to my value to society, and also just not to my value to myself. If I don't use my time, because I still have to optimize this problem, I still haven't optimized, then this is a potential problem. So therefore, of course, we have to think about the bigger picture of being vegan, and also of preventing climate change, and also of not maybe or potentially decreasing your meat consumption in favor of decreasing the CO2 and also the methane that is produced as a result of people eating meat. But let's now take a look at these nutrients again. Of course, now, if I switch to 10 eggs in a given day, this is the only kind of sensible thing I could come up with. Of course, peanuts would also be, for example, an option. Peanuts are actually not real nuts. The only problem I have with peanuts is that I have basically a side effect of eating peanuts. And the side effect is that I have probably increased values of inflammation. And I noticed this because whenever I have peanuts in my diet for an extended period of time, my joints just become more inflamed, you could say. And this is not something I would actually just like to have as someone who is considerably or comparably young, given I'm not an 80-year-old who should have maybe trouble with his joints. But I also don't want to have trouble with my joints if I'm an 80-year-old. But given the fact that age basically increases the risk, or is the key thing that increases the risk over time for all these different diseases, and given that I have a fairly young age, ideally I just would be very healthy at this point in time, in order for then, in the future, for me to also be healthy, because it won't get better over time. So therefore, if I'm avoiding also peanuts, the only thing I am left with is kind of eggs. And also if I still have the assumption that I don't buy individual nuts and then mix them together. But again, also with the individual nuts, there are just too many carbs that come with the nuts in order to significantly increase your protein to an amount that would result in an amount that is considered kind of the standard, and not on the lower end, like many studies already proposed, like the 0.8 grams. Because apart from the fact that maybe you don't need as much protein, also if you fast, and I usually fast for at least half the day, or maybe almost all of the day, and then only eat for 2 hours or maybe 4 hours or 6 hours. If you fast more, then the body tends to use the structures it already has that are kind of misbuilt within our body. It just destroys them and rebuilds them and uses the protein from this, which is called autophagy, but it also is probably not only called autophagy. So with these 10 eggs, what this results in now is 2.5 K of calories, 55 grams of carbs, which would be acceptable, 212 grams of fat, and 96 grams of protein, which is a macronutrient ratio of 9% for the carbs, which is very nice because it's below 10%. What I've kind of set for myself is 10% from carbs in terms of the energy that is given by different macronutrients. 10% from carbs, 80% from fat, which is a common ketogenic distribution, I guess, and 20% from protein. And now what we are reaching with this is 96 grams of protein. And this is also protein you can actually kind of use compared to a protein source that is maybe peanuts. Because there is also something called bioavailability. And the bioavailability of eggs is, I think, 100%. So the egg, I don't know if this is true, but the egg seems to act as the measuring unit to measure the bioavailability of protein against. What is the bioavailability? As previously discussed, it is how much of the protein, how much of the amino acids we consume as grams, for example, or measured in grams, we can actually convert into body weight. So now, if I don't eat, so I did never eat 10 eggs in a given day, at least not planned, I guess. So the main problem I maybe had in the past was that I was in this vicious cycle of having too high of carbs because of trying to be vegetarian, of trying to be maybe also potentially vegan. That's also something I tried and also tracked, and also can look up the days on which I was vegan. I looked for a few minutes, but I couldn't find any value in my habit databank where I actually track these things, because my habit databank is not searchable, and I just couldn't find it. Probably due to me not being able to find it now. Probably in between a couple of dozen days to a couple of 100 dozen days. Not 100 dozen, but 100 days. And so, let's now try to conclude with just looking up what chicken is actually made of. How much fat does it come with? How much carbs does it come with? And could you use it potentially as a lever for a given nutrition to just increase the protein? Because that's what I am trying to do. That's what you probably also may be trying to do. Let's just take chicken and let's replace the egg for the chicken. So we had 750 kilocalories of eggs. And unless you want to consume 10 eggs in a given day, and this is your main source, and that's also the only source. Of course, sometimes you can get a little bit of protein from avocado, but the protein from avocado comes again with a certain ratio to carbs. And if you want to keep the carbs at a fixed level of at maximum 50 grams of carbs in a given day, then you cannot just add anything that is a vegetable in order to increase protein. This is just not something you can do only with a protein powder. And a protein powder is expensive for the calories, and also is something you have to buy in a separate way, because you usually cannot get a good protein powder at your grocery store. And it also is just a very artificial product you might not want in your nutrition, because one of the spectrums you could use in order to become or to make your nutrition healthier is to go from something that is very artificial to something that is very similar in nature. And by using this, you're getting rid, for example, of waffles, which don't grow on trees. Who would have thought? And you get more to something that is an apple. Of course, an apple also comes with a lot of fructose, which potentially also increases your hunger over time. But at least it comes also with a lot of water. So the unit in itself is something that is at least consumable, whereas a waffle, for example, is something that already has downsides to it once you consume it. For 88 kilocalories, which is 100 grams. So 100 grams of chicken only has 88 kilocalories. And it comes with 0.9 grams of carbs, with 1.8 gram of fat, and with 19.4 grams of protein. So the protein to carb ratio, or much rather the carb to protein ratio, is 1 to 20. And that's ridiculous, because we cannot get a ratio of more than 1 to 2 out of any given vegan food. And so we don't have a lever within the vegan foods. Only if we then expand it to vegetarian, we actually have something we can add, the eggs that have a very reasonable macronutrient distribution. And so it's not that I am now totally considering going not or quitting being vegetarian, but I mean, there is really a point to this question. If we just assume that we now wanted to add the protein that is missing to the previously mentioned thing, and we get rid of potentially also the nuts, because the nuts also cause a lot of calories. So we take the vegan 2.5K protein shake. Not protein shake, but actually meal replacement shake. We leave the oil and things like these the same. We reduce now the nuts, the mixed nuts, to 50 grams. The next thing we do is we get to a reasonable amount of eggs, or let's just not take the eggs even, let's just add the chicken. Let's just add chicken, so we have now 1.5K of calories, mega calories. And we now just add chicken until we have 2.5K calories, 2.5 mega calories. So we add, let's just say, 500 grams of chicken. As we just found out, 88 grams only, not 88 grams, but 88 calories only per 100 grams. So if we add 500 grams of chicken, we get a total of 97 grams of protein. So for every, as previously stated, for every 100 grams of chicken, you get 20 grams of protein, which is ridiculously high, given the fact that you don't get a large increase in these other two macronutrients. Of course, relatively they always stay the same because a given food only has a given macronutrient distribution or ratio. But now if we add these, then we result in 2000 calories. The main reason I even expanded to 2.5 calories, given the fact that also there seems to be an argument for constraining calories actually increasing longevity over time. So we just added 100 grams almost of protein. And for these 100 grams, we only had the cost of 450 calories. And we now don't even result with all the other things, like the supplements, like the 110 grams of calories from the omega-3 fatty acids that are also just oil, that also add just oil and not protein. Let's actually check. They have 3 grams of protein for 110 grams of carbs. We now have 2K of calories, and that's very nice. We couldn't get this high protein, and it's only the 100 grams of protein are only now from the chicken. It's 500 grams, it's a lot, I know, but if we replaced it with eggs, for example, we couldn't get as much protein. We also would get a lot more fat, and since fat, as again already stated, has just a higher density, actually twice as high, we now have a total of 2K calories with only 49 grams of carbs, with 144 grams of fat and 122 grams of protein. And if we divide now 80 by 122, what this results in is, it's the wrong thing. What we actually need to do is divide 120 by 80, and then we get the grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And this results in 1.5. So if you just would assume, you would simplify the protein per kilogram of body weight down to these 3 things. Either you take 1 gram of protein per kilogram, or you increase it by 50%, then you land on 1.5, or you go very high on the protein and probably are a bodybuilder that maybe also uses enhancements, and then you result in 2 grams per every kilogram of protein. Now also, if you actually increase your muscle mass over time, you also increase your weight over time. So if I potentially would gain 20 kilograms of muscle, which I won't, but then I would have 100 grams of, no, I would need for, so I would weigh 100 kilogram, and then I would actually also need 150 grams of protein just for, again, this scenario, 1.5 or 200 grams of protein. And there is no way I can get without adding a lot of calories. I would get 200 grams of protein. And now let's take the additional step, because previously we had 2.5 megacalories. Kilo, mega, giga, not gigacalorie. Oh, megacalories. I don't know if I said mega or giga. So let's try double the amount of chicken. Why? Because we still have 500 kilocalories left. And that's just ridiculous. It's a kilogram of chicken. And what this results in is, so it didn't take my intake. It results in 194 grams of protein, which in terms of just adding protein to your diet is a complete jackpot. And it's only 17 grams of fat. It's only 8.8 grams of carbs. It's just ridiculous. For years I tried to optimize these things, and I replaced 4 eggs with 5 eggs. And here is the solution, the potential solution if you are not vegetarian. You just add chicken, and it's so easy. And I would never have thought that this would have been so easy if you just wouldn't be vegetarian. And this is the problem you have to solve, I guess. Let's just see what this results in terms of total calories. It's 2.3 megacalories. It's only 53.3 grams of carbs, so it is ketogenic compared to the other things that are only low carb. I couldn't come up with a normal meal I would take without relying on, again, peanuts that wouldn't result in more than 50 grams of carbs. And every gram of carbs, so for example, I had a lot of carrots in my diet. And as I realized, carrots have quite a high carb ratio. And then I left out the carrots, for example. I also left out other foods, but the carrots, for example, just meant that I just didn't experience hunger that much as before, because the carbs just drive to hunger all the time. The hunger that appears a few times, not a few times, but a few hours after you ate. So now we have a potential solution, which is to not be vegan or vegetarian, because then it is easy. It is just so much easier to get the protein in. We have 219 grams of protein. That is more than twice the amount of protein I would need at the maximum, at the highest value we just established, at 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. It's a ratio of 2.75 grams of protein per kilograms of body weight. And it's only 2.3 thousand calories. So the question, where vegetarians and vegans actually get their protein from, is from nowhere, really. If you are, there is basically no lever you can use in order to increase your protein. There is no real lever that you can just use in order to increase your protein intake without increasing the total amount of calories and also the amount of carbs, which are, again, given a ketogenic diet, which I try to do. Of course, not everybody tries to do a ketogenic diet. And also not everybody tries to do, at least, if possible, a very short time frame of eating. But that this would have been so easy if I just wouldn't have been vegetarian for the last few years, I never would have believed, I guess. Of course, I have to mention chicken is kind of one of the prime examples. There are other meat sorts from different animals, obviously, and also from different parts of the animals that just have more fat. And chicken is usually reasonably lean. Of course, this also comes with the downsides of consuming meat. And I'm not trying to convince you that you now should quit being a vegetarian. And I probably, at least for a few months, will probably reconsider this decision again and again, because that's also something I have, at least to some extent, identified with. I never really identified as a vegan because I just didn't want the stigma with being a vegan, and I also there was no need to go vegan if I still had the benefit of the eggs in my diet that would probably overall increase my output in life, given that I probably need a little bit of protein. And there is also something else I need to mention, and that's kind of now the theory this plays in. So the last years, let's just say you work out. Let's just say the sentence I mentioned before is thrown into the trash. You work out. Then, as you work out, you basically have an increased protein need because you actually actively destroy your muscles. So then what happens is that you would need something that actually replenishes the muscle or is the building material for the muscles again. Of course, this could come from internal sources, like internal structures you can actually rebuild, but only to a certain extent. Of course, you need to also eat over time. So apart from you potentially choosing the path of being a sun eater, or whatever these people are called who claim to just eat from the sun, you probably need some source of food intake. And now the macronutrient distribution, or the macronutrient ratio, determines how much of the needed fixed amount of protein that you need for a given amount of muscle destroying or muscle damage you have. Because if you train intensively and you train at the same intensity over time, of course your amount of muscle also will increase. So therefore, with the increase of amount of muscle, you will also need more protein, given a fixed percentage of the muscle is damaged over time. Of course, it also becomes harder and harder to damage the muscle through training, but still, you then have a higher total need of protein. So now, if you only now are able to consume foods together with fat, together with carbs, then the carbs constantly keep you hungry, and the fat keeps you fat. It's of course not as easy as this, but given a fixed needed amount of protein, if you only can get more protein, if you also eat more fat, then a possible solution, if the body doesn't get enough protein, for the body would be to just crave more food. Because in more food is more protein. Because at a given fixed ratio of these macronutrients, the thing you need is more food, which comes with the downside of potentially being overweight and storing too much fat, which happened to me in the last years actually. My body fat is too high. It is borderline basically being overweight, even though maybe I don't completely look like it. And also potentially because I have a beard and now long hair, it is obscured more. And it is also obscured partially by the fact that I have a little bit of muscle underneath my body. But it's not that much amount of muscle. And I also wasn't able to build up muscle within the last years. Of course, there is also the natural limit, and I'm not on steroids. But what I'm trying to say is, eating more food would be a reasonable adaptation to the fact that your body needs a fixed given amount of protein and doesn't get it from food. And if you now are trying to be vegan without protein powder, or you're trying to be vegetarian without eating 10 eggs a day, or doing something else that's comparably crazy, of course, if you then, I mean, if you once established eating, for example, 1 kilogram of chicken a day, then 10 eggs a day is not that crazy anymore. But I just would have never really guessed this. So it's a cycle, because if the body then doesn't get the protein it needs, it cannot rebuild the muscle in time for the next workout. Then the only possible solution the body now can come up with is either reduce the total amount of muscle, because less muscle at a given damaged percentage needs again less protein in order to keep the muscle healthy, basically, without the muscle deteriorating. So at a given need for muscle that is established by working out, the result, and also a given fixed macronutrient ratio that is just not optimal because it has too little protein in it, what the body can do is either decrease the intensity you can perform, because if you decrease the intensity, then over time, from the need that is kind of signaled to the body for a given amount of muscle that then has a given amount of strength for the workout is just less. If you over time, for let's say 2 years, and in my case more like 5 years, are not able to perform as well in the workouts, you are not able to keep the muscle. And you are also not able to increase the muscle size. So what happens is that you have less muscle and therefore also less needed protein. This would be a very rational solution the body could come up with. So the results of having this fixed nutrient ratio within a vegan and vegetarian diet, with leaving the dairies out, is that your body needs to adapt somehow. And the adaptations the body could possibly come up with, the optimal adaptations would be to decrease at a given willpower the performance it gives you. So if you request 50 push-ups, it only will give you 25. The power for 25 only. And you would need a large, so of course with willpower also, if you for example use 80% of your given willpower at any point in time to demand a certain intensity from your body or a certain performance from your body, then maybe if you then have 1% more, this doesn't give you back 1% more. So maybe the body, as intensity increases, makes it harder and harder to actually give the given performance to you, or to deliver the performance to you. So it would be harder and harder. So therefore there is potentially a trade-off where if you then increase your willpower with another 1%, you just don't get another 1% of delivered performance anymore. Or yeah, just performance. So now the two adaptations the body could potentially come up with is basically decrease the performance. Decrease the overall performance you are able to perform at a given level of willpower. And the second one would be to just eat more of the given thing that has protein in it, but in a ratio that is too low, and therefore you would need to eat more. Therefore, over time, you would accumulate more fat, because you need to accumulate the fat, because otherwise you don't get to the protein. And that's a very vicious circle. And the only way to escape this circle is by either adding a protein powder to your vegan diet, or by increasing your egg intake to 10, or by not being vegetarian anymore. So the final answer to the question, where do vegetarians and vegans get your protein from, is not something that is ridiculous, but is maybe one of the fundamental questions you need to answer, because it touches on the macronutrient ratio. And if you don't get the macronutrient ratio right, and you have too high carbs, then maybe you just don't perform as well in your entire lifetime, if you never decide to try it and make the change. And maybe for some people it doesn't work. Maybe there probably is not that much science supporting the high mental performance, even though there are a few points which I already discussed in previous videos. It is not that the whole world now thinks you should go keto. It works well for certain individuals that may have some maybe genetic specialties, or I don't know. It works for me. That's something I can say. I don't think about food. If I'm on keto or I'm fasting for a long period of time, my mind is, if there is a Ferris wheel and you took the Ferris wheel and spin it, and you spin it again, and you spin it again, and you spin it again, without ever stopping it, and stopping it is the meal intake, the carb intake, then it just goes higher and higher and higher. And this is what my mind feels like. If I'm fasting or on a ketogenic diet, I can't just do more and more, and then it compounds, because the day before you did this, and now because you did this, you can do this. And it compounds, and after a week, you feel like you're totally different compared to 4 weeks before, or 8 weeks before. And so, to finally answer the question, where vegans and vegetarians get their protein from, is probably one of the most important questions to answer in terms of nutrition.